Welcome to the Pursuing Life podcast. I am your host, Monica Kirsch, and I'm joined today by Liz Rodriguez and Steve Kilgore. And we are talking today about the trials that Jesus underwent leading up to his crucifixion. So let's start with a little bit of background in this story. One thing that I know trips me up a lot when I'm reading this, and I'm sure is true of others, is there are so many characters at play here. And it's really easy to be like, okay, wait a second. Who is this? What's going on here? So can we unpack? Who are the characters? What is their role here?
That's a good question because, well, let's break it down into two sets. So we have the religious trials.
Yep.
Basically 3 of them, and 3 civil trials. So let's kind of break them into those. So in the religious ones, they're the ones who go and arrest Jesus.
Yeah.
In one sense, Rome didn't have anything to worry about because Jesus didn't have an army. So
Wasn't a threat.
he's not a threat. At least they don't think he's a threat.
Right.
And so you get the religious leaders who it's a threat to them. And so they're the ones that put him on trial first. And so the group that's doing it is the Sanhedrin. It's the group of religious leaders, 70 plus the high priest. And so it's a big group.
Yeah.
Whether everybody's there or not because of how hastily they did it, we don't know, but that's who's in it. The Sanhedrin was made up of priests, Sadducees, and Pharisees.
Okay.
Priests who had the duty in the temple, Sadducees who were the wealthy who really controlled the temple, and the Pharisees who were really common people. They had jobs, but they got onto the Sanhedrin at different points. So that's kind of who's in the room.
I just think the crowd is fascinating to me in every kind of as we navigate through this because it's such this back and forth. And as I'm watching who's in the room and as they're trying to make their way to the right room along the journey, I mean, one of the things I see, which we'll get to later, is just the patience of Jesus on display where he's like, oh, here I am. And I'm just going to kind of bounce to these different places, not in a beautiful way. I think it's easy for me to think that this would have been just a peaceful day in the neighborhood. And you're like, no, he's probably getting beaten along the way. He's getting mocked, ridiculed. And as he's making his way through these cases, just the patience that he shows with all of his different audiences.
Yeah.
When you just said that, Liz, it made me picture, because one of the scenes is Peter in the courtyard warming himself, all of that. But this is a spectacle.
Right.
I'm thinking of who's in the trial, the group that's in the trial, but the crowd that went to arrest him and everybody else that's part of this mass activity, it would have been fascinating to kind of see, because you got the servant girl interacting with Peter, you've got soldiers, you've got, probably some of the merchants that he's cast out. You got all these different people that are there. So it is probably a chaotic scene.
And sometimes I wonder, when I'm doing the announcements, I spot faces in the room, you know, and then you begin to notice they always sit front right. And so you're as you're kind of moving through this, are Jesus and Peter and them being oh, there's a familiar face. Oh, you were on a different side of this argument last week. You were at the triumphal entry saying other things about me and my character. Yeah. And so even that part of the story here, I'm always oh, the humility of Jesus, that we're watching the crowd shift to this very, pomp and circumstance arrival that isn't beautiful, that sometimes I want to hope it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I have wondered is what is kind of the difference between the religious trial system and the civil trial system, where what grounds did the Jewish leaders have to arrest somebody?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, because they were given incredible latitude by Rome. In extra biblical literature, Rome kind of referred to Israel as a troubled place. because of their inability to worship other gods and unwillingness to do that. Like everybody else was okay with that. Jews were not. And so it was always the trouble spot.
Interesting.
And so they had very strong leaders. So Pilate, for one, in one of the characters in the Roman trials, there is Roman historians who talk about the times that the emperor, the Caesar, got mad at Pilate for being too rough and causing too many problems in Israel. And he was eventually removed for it.
Okay.
And so they had total control, but they controlled it through the leaders.
Okay.
The high priest was actually appointed by Pilate.
Wow.
That's the amount of control that they had. And so so you get a little bit of that. So they were the authority in Israel.
Okay.
Under the Romans. They couldn't execute somebody unless it was not a thought out thing. So when Stephen was executed in Acts with stoning, they didn't get reprimanded for that because it was the crowd that did it. It wasn't the leaders who did it.
Right.
But in this case, it's the leaders who are instigating it, not really the crowd.
Right. That's fascinating. So they take Jesus first to Annas, who it says is the father-in-law of the high priest. Why did they take Jesus to Annas first?
So you know how positional authority is different than declared authority? So he's the authority because of who he is.
Okay.
The other guy has been put in power.
Yeah.
And so everybody knows that. So they go first to the guy that really has the authority.
Okay. All
I always
right.
think of it as he's the one who, when they're in a circle, you're looking to see if he's going to nod his head in agreement, because then you're going to agree too.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
even if stuff's over your head, you're like, he's the pulse of the room and of the crowd. And so they kind of are like bypassing the formal middleman and going to him. That allows them to be like, how much traction are we going to get here?
And then because of that, because he says, yes, let's go to the next step, then it gets the traction and they're going into the room with everybody because they had to be with the high priest for this to actually work. Yeah. But one of the interesting things, there's a huge debate in scholarship as to whether these trials are actually trials or just a grand jury. Because everything about what they did goes against their rules.
Yeah.
They never had a trial on Friday because they didn't want to have a day off for Sabbath. They thought that was cruel. So you always had 2 days off. They never did it at night. They always did it in a specific hall on the temple grounds. None of that happens. So they break all their rules. So either they were foolish, and we know they were very calculated. So they weren't foolish. They were just, all they're doing is collecting the ammunition to get to Pilate.
Yeah.
So in one sense, we call it a trial, but probably it's more like a grand jury. They're sequestered. They're collecting the information. They're hearing and saying, is there enough evidence?
Right.
Well, in this case, they're actually manufacturing the evidence.
Yeah. So that they can then get Jesus before Pilate, which is where we get to that kind of second half that you talked about earlier. So who are the characters then at play there? Yeah.
Again, basically, it's Pilate and Herod Antipas. So Israel was divided into states. We'll use that, regions. The Galilee area where Jesus spent most of his time is the control of Herod Agrippa.
Okay.
Or Herod Antipas. The coastal area then across the southern part where Israel was where Pilate had authority. Pilate is really the governor, and Herod is sort of an appointed king, back to Herod the Great. So those are the two guys. Pilate is the one who had the authority in the region, but because Jesus did most of his stuff, he kind of defers to him. And I think the text even says they didn't like each other, but they became friends after this, which is like Oh, interesting friendship.
Right. Especially because you see both of their reactions to Jesus are very different.
Yeah.
You know, Pilate is like trying to like wash his hands clean of anything that he shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
And Herod is like, let me see if, you'll do a miracle for me. That would be interesting. And yet somehow their friendship begins over their very different reactions, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Was that quote of like, keep your enemies closer? And on some level, they are both aware that though he doesn't come with an army, Jesus does have the power to change the way the world will interact and to change Rome. And I mean, we'll see that in the long haul, that Jesus ultimately wins and all the things take place. But in this moment, you're like, oh, their common denominator isn't actually anything positive, but in the negative, they're like sparks this moment within of like a weird friendship, which just always causes me some pause to be like, well, we should filter like who our community is and like how we got here real quick. Because
If we associate because of common enemy, we might be in trouble.
Yes.
What'd you learn from Pilate today?
Yes, exactly. So then the other ones that we see in these passages, you mentioned Peter. We also see Judas and, his guilt in some ways, his remorse. We see he ultimately hangs himself in the end. And then, as we talked about yesterday in our main services, we see Barabbas then at the end of this passage. So I am curious. You just said, what did we learn from Pilate today? What do we learn? How can we maybe even see some of ourselves in the stories of these characters? We have Annas, Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, Peter, Pilate, Herod, Judas, and Barabbas. As you've read through these passages, what are you pulling out of these snippets of stories?
I'll start with Judas, which may be a weird place to start, but I just read it, and every time I read it, I think our sin will always catch up to us. And there's arguments to be made that Judas, whether or not he was a believer or not, we'll never know this side of eternity. But what we see is like shame is real and the weight of guilt is heavy. And so even as I was reading it, I was like, man, God, like purge from me the things that do not draw me closer to you. Because I don't want to be drawn away from you. And that's what we see in the Judas narrative, is this like greed within him that ultimately pulls him out of the community. And so I want us to like glean from and like do the opposite and be like, hey, what draws us closer to the Lord?
And if you think of Judas, he spent 3 years with Jesus.
Right.
He saw the miracles. He heard the teaching. He had every opportunity to respond appropriately and chooses not to. I love reading the Gospel of John, because every time there's John as the son of thunder doesn't miss an opportunity to get a dig in on Judas.
That's right.
It's all the way through and just constant, because it hurt him. So, he is the one so close to Jesus, and the guy who does that, you get this sense of that always stuck with him.
Yeah.
And so I think there is something about the amount of exposure to truth isn't going to necessarily guarantee a positive response. And then sin always overpromises and underdelivers.
Yep. I love, there's a quote in The Final Days of Jesus about Judas where they said, was he disillusioned with Jesus when he realized that Jesus was not going to be the militaristic Messiah he was looking for? Did he hope that his betrayal would force Jesus' hand and cause him to overthrow the present Jewish leadership and the Romans? And it's like, man, haven't we been talking about that this whole series, where like we can become so disillusioned, like our expectations become so high and we actually forget like who is on the throne. And I just wonder like how many of us have to some extent like been in those shoes where Judas may have been, and we don't know. We don't know if it was his greed. We don't know if it was disillusionment. Like we don't know, but man, is that a little bit of like a humbling wake-up call where you're like, ooh, I need to temper my expectations, because you're right. I don't want to get to that point. I don't want to get to the point where I am so far from who the Lord actually is.
And it's such a stark contrast from what we see in Peter in this portion of the text, where I mean, Jesus has told him, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter, being Peter,
Classic.
is like, never, not
Classic.
me. Which honestly would probably be some of our responses.
Right.
We'd be like, no, I've been near you for these years. I've watched you do the things I would never. And then we see him deny.
Yeah.
But at the end of the denying, he recognizes what has happened and is grieved over it,
Right.
and like weeps. And the humility that's seen in that moment and the conviction that's felt causes this ultimate change, which if you read on or get to even Acts, you see his life flourishing in light of what Jesus has done.
Right.
And to me, that contrast between one has remorse, penance is not the same thing as repentance.
Right.
Feeling bad isn't the same as turning from. And with Peter, we get that pivot, which is when you read his 2 letters, you get this completely different picture. I know you referenced it a little in last week's podcast, but that concept that you go from a guy who always sticks his foot in his mouth, and when he says, "I would never," he really believes that, and he probably thought he could, but when you get to the epistles, you get this guy who has learned humility and now talks about submitting to rulers instead of fighting rulers, and all of that transformation, not because he felt bad about what he did, but he allowed the failure to result in really turning. And so I think we get that amazing picture of the failure of Judas was final because he couldn't deal with it, where Peter allows the Lord to restore him and bring from a dark point to a great witness.
Yeah. Steve, you've been really intentional about making sure that we're kind of balancing the bad rep that Peter gets here. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So we often think of Peter as the one who is the singled out among the disciples other than Judas who denies him.
Right.
But the picture really is everybody else runs away. John and Peter actually go to the house of the high priest. John is known because of who he is, and he gets Peter in the door, and it's like, that takes courage. So we tend to think, well, they didn't have courage, they abandoned. Yes, but he's following up into that point, which maybe even is more than what I might have done. I might have been with the other guys trying to figure out how deep can I hide. And so I think there's something about that there is a genuineness to his desire to be true.
Right.
But the sheer chaos of the event and everything that's going on overwhelms him, because it's not like a soldier comes up and says, it's a little servant girl. Well, that's my sanctified imagination. I picture her as this little thing that just kind of looks up and says, aren't you?
Right.
And that is where he collapses.
And I can't help but wonder, too, if it's not even like the fear of what will happen to him if he's honest, but even just like the desire to not want to deal with the consequences. I mean, those of us who are conflict averse, and I include myself in that, it's like, how many times do I just like avoid conversations because I just don't want to deal with the consequences of like having those conversations? And so maybe Peter doesn't even realize what he's doing in the moment, where he's just like, I don't know what you're talking about, trying to just avoid this. And I mean, I just am like, how many times do I do that? Where like having the hard conversation probably would have been the easier thing to do.
Yeah.
When I mean, Steve, you mentioned it, but I like referenced last week that like Peter then writes, like the enemy is like prowling around like a lion, be on guard. And part of me wonders if Peter had read Peter, would he have like, been like, wait a minute, this is one of those opportunities? Because that's what I want to learn from Peter is, man, I want the courage to go in, and I also want the eyes to be aware that our enemy is real. And we're like watching some of that play out. And I'm with you. Peter's the one who I want to meet. I think I just see so much of myself in him. I could totally have been the girl hopping out of the boat and getting like 2 steps on water and then being like, just kidding. Just kidding. And like, it's kind of that same thing where he gets like 2 steps in and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, this moment wait a minute, I don't think I'm ready. But then the transformation that happens, you just see him then like own the courage that we've seen glimpses of leading up to the later part.
And he will demonstrate that courage after the resurrection.
Yeah.
So there is that redemption thing that goes on that really turns him from the fearful to the leader of the church, getting arrested and not worried about it. So you get that the maybe the reason Jesus picked him as one of the disciples because of that. And so there's great things, but he's not on trial.
He's
Right.
not.
Right. It puts into perspective, though, that question of like, what would you tell your past self? Like, if you could talk to yourself 15 years ago, what would you tell you? You know? And it's like, well, Peter kind of did that.
Yeah.
And what an exercise that could be from a faith perspective. Just going like, what have you learned and what do you need to share with other people so that they can learn it from you? Just like we learned from Peter.
The other kind of character I think I see at play is the crowd, especially in terms of Barabbas and just the power that a mob can have, which we've kind of saw in a beautiful example at the triumphal entry. And then now we're seeing the flip side of that here. But just, I mean, their voice is very much carried out throughout this all of these different trial points and pinpoints too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I wonder with Barabbas too, you know, it's this amazing picture of like the sin that Jesus took on himself so that we could walk free. That's exactly what happened with Barabbas. Like he took on the sin and Barabbas walked free when like Barabbas was the guilty one. And I just can't help but wonder like, what happened to Barabbas? You know, like, was he changed? Was his life any different? Did he even understand what was happening? And it's like this bigger picture to me that I actually do need to let this change my life. That I can't walk away from this going like, oh, yep, that happened. I'm just going to keep living the way I live because it's too big of a thing to not allow it to affect me. So I just wonder, you know, did he even know?
There are intimations in church history that he was changed, but there's no real evidence.
Right.
But I think if you take his story and then look at all the other characters, it's the same question.
Yep.
In Acts, which you guys are doing in the women's study, we get these glimpses of Pharisees who were now followers of Jesus. You get some of that some of them who put him on trial and who were against him and were crying out, crucify him, give us Barabbas, were actually changed. But probably not changed until the resurrection. And so there's something like we tend to look at the trials and the cross and we end the story there rather than resurrection and exaltation. And I think there's a real powerful thing about what that does in the transformation.
Yeah.
So if all you see is Jesus on the cross, it's probably not going to lead to transformation.
Yep.
If you understand who he is and he's raised in vindication of who he is and then exalted, that's when you go, that's who I want to follow.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly.
And that's where we fit in the story. And so sometimes even as you were talking, Monica, I was like, oh, but do we live changed because of these trials and because Jesus was headed to the cross and was resurrected and exalted? And I think some of us don't. I think some of us could sit here and be like, oh, I know sin in my life that I don't want to turn from, or I know these areas of weakness that I don't want to open my hand to him, or things I'm clinging so tightly to. And when I've taken, looked inside my own heart, what I realize is, oh, it's because I'm not viewing this weak rightly. I'm weakening what Jesus did on the cross. And then I can walk away from it and not be changed. But when I actually look at it correctly in the fullness, that's when I walk away changed because of who Jesus is and what he did for me personally. That it very well could have been me instead of Barabbas. In theory, it is me. Jesus is on the cross so that I can walk in freedom and spend eternity with him one day. And that hope, I don't want it to get lost on us, but sometimes I think the other 364 days of the year, it can. If we don't actually have our eyes set on the fullness of who Jesus is.
Yeah. Can I just, one thing you said, we all spending eternity with him. And I think one of the things that these stories help me is to remember that when we enter into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, eternity starts now.
Yeah.
We're not waiting for a day like when everything's no, right now we're in perfect relationship with God because of Jesus.
Yep.
That's what the cross does for us.
Yeah.
And so then we're anticipating what he's going to do with us, but we get to enjoy that present reality that goes into eternity rather than waiting. Well, we're just going to deal with life now. And, thinking of last week and getting people to record their prayers and all of those prayers, people are carrying a lot of weight. And so a little bit of the hope is not what we wrote down. It's the line at the bottom, not my will, but yours be done. And in the presence of now I can have a relationship with him. Whether the prayer request that I pinned to the board is answered, the one who can answer it and who has given me the greatest gift is there. Yeah. And I think that hope that we get from that in the midst of paying attention to the details of this week of Jesus' life is helpful.
Yeah. One of the things that stood out to me this week as I was reading through these passages was ultimately, as we talked about, the charges against Jesus keep changing. And it's like he's never going to win because the bar just keeps getting higher and higher. Not that he's trying to win. That's not his goal in this. But it just reminds me that like with Jesus, like it's covered. He's never going to keep moving the bar. We don't have to keep achieving more and more and more in order to win his approval. When he died on the cross and rose again, he accomplished all of that for us. And so he went through that moving of the goalposts so that I don't have to. Yeah. And that brings me incredible peace, knowing that he's got it and I am safe in his grace. So we'll talk more about the crucifixion and the resurrection next week. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves.
We really want to have that conversation.
I know it's the best part. It's the best part, but it's coming. But as we close, is there anything else that you guys learn about Jesus as you read through what he endured in these trials?
Yeah, I mean, I said it earlier, but I think it's true even in light of what both of you said, like just his patience with people, which shows his sovereignty at play throughout all of this. That, I mean, we know from the garden, he knows what's coming. So he's in this moment, we're watching it all unfold, and he knows what's coming. We're not talking about it, Monica, but like he knows what's coming. And to see that like that was always the intent from the beginning. Jesus knew, like I'm headed to the cross. And for me, then personally, to be like, do I believe and live in light of the things we've talked about today? Do I actually believe who Jesus is and what he's done and that he is sovereign? And that even when I, when you pin the prayer request to the board or as you're writing it down, do you believe the bottom line that like he is in control of this whole entire thing? And that is the beauty of this week for me, that he is still in control, even when it feels like he's not in control by the world standards.
Yeah. I think I'm struck that in both sets of trials, in the religious trials, their accusation is blasphemy. And there were a whole bunch of things that could have classified as blasphemy, including disregarding the leaders. If you're the one trying somebody, that's the one you're going to go for, and they do. But in all of that, they basically collect the information and allow Jesus to say, let me tell you who I am. Because they ask, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?
Yeah.
They don't want to use the name of God. They're really good at keeping their own rules, so they don't even use God's name. And then his response is to quote a prophecy, to quote Daniel 7, to basically go, if I answer that question, you don't really know who I am. So I'm going to tell you from your own scriptures who I am. And I don't think it's to change their mind and to change the accusation. But what it does is they collect all this information. He turns it to what he wants it to say for those of his followers afterwards, to be able to say, I am who I said I was. and I proved it. And so that trial does that. And then the Roman trial, there's a principle in historical investigation called the criterion of embarrassment. You would never include something that would be embarrassing if you're starting a movement.
Right.
And the Gospels are full of it. All the failures of the disciples and all of that. But in Rome and in Judaism and in Greek society, someone crucified was the lowest of low. You would never use that as the point that held your belief together. And so to me, it's another confirmation that these stories are true and therefore that we can believe them, because you wouldn't have done that. You would have used some other trait. And it's fascinating to me. I'm working through Galatians with our men's study, and how much Galatians is the first book that Paul writes. And in chapters 3, 4, and 5, how often he refers to the crucifixion, because the Gospels haven't been written when he wrote it. And he uses the crucifixion. He says, it was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. You're using that as your means of saying, let's elevate him? No, in that culture, that would have been the wrong thing to do. But it's a reason to believe.
Yeah.
Because the thing that would have been the discrediting fact becomes the central thought. And to me, the trials, basically, the two trials, elevate all the truth about him, even though it's used against him, and they're unjust, at minimum unjust, if not a bit of illegal with it. It proves, and it becomes foundational for us.
Yep. What Satan intends for evil, God uses for good. Just further proves that to be true.
Yep.
Well, we could keep going on and on and on, but I think this has given us a lot to continue to think about, to chew on. For those listening, we hope that this has helped you to better understand these passages and that you have been able to look at them in a new way, just as I know the three of us have this week. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks, guys, for taking the time to chat today. And we hope you'll join us again next week as we unpack Good Friday and Easter.